This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious. Nothing good ever arrived on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were the universe's way of reminding you that Monday was over, and Friday was still an abstract concept. Mortivex the Undying, Necromancer, Raiser of the Dead, Scourge of the Living, holder of 3 graduate degrees in forbidden arts, stood at his mailbox in his bathrobe and stared at the envelope with the same contempt he usually reserved for paladins and oat milk. The return address read, Shadowpine Estates HOMOWNERS Association. Beneath it, in a font that managed to be simultaneously cheerful and threatening, where community comes first, he should have moved to a detached farmhouse. He knew this. He had known this the moment the realtor, a relentlessly optimistic woman named Linda who smelled of bergamot and spoke exclusively in exclamation points, had shown him the listing. It's a fixer-upper, she had said, gesturing at the Victorian Gothic monstrosity sitting at the end of a cul-de-sac. Lots of charm, great bones. He had pointed out that the previous owner had installed a summoning circle in the basement. She had called it a unique conversation piece. He had bought it for 12% under asking. That was 4 months ago. He had spent the first 2 months repainting the exterior midnight obsidian, a color he had chosen himself and which Linda had described as bold, installing blackout curtains and quietly reinforcing the basement floor. The neighbors had been politely distant in the way suburban people are politely distant, waving from driveways, leaving plates of cookies on porches, absolutely not making eye contact. He had been content. Then he had raised the skeletons, and everything had gone sideways. To be clear, and Mortivex felt this point was not being adequately appreciated by anyone, the skeletons had been a professional necessity. He was a necromancer. Raising the undead was not a hobby or a recreational activity or some kind of eccentric personal quirk. It was his job. It was, in fact, the only item on his resume that he hadn't had to lie about. You didn't get 3 graduate degrees in forbidden arts and then just not raise skeletons. That would be like becoming a dentist and then never looking at teeth. It would be professionally irresponsible. The skeletons in question were 12 in number, sourced from the municipal cemetery on Birch Street, though sourced was perhaps a generous term. Borrowed without permission from their eternal rest was more accurate, but he preferred not to phrase it that way even internally. They were good skeletons as skeletons went, well assembled, motivated. They did not complain about working conditions, which put them ahead of most living employees he'd had. He had intended to use them for a specific and entirely legitimate necromantic purpose, which he had fully planned to complete within 72 hours. Unfortunately, on hour 63, he had become engrossed in a particularly compelling problem involving ley line harmonics and had simply forgotten to unraise them. For 5 days, the skeletons had continued wandering his backyard, rattling up and down the fence line, occasionally attempting to rake leaves with their phalanges, and staring at the neighboring houses with the hollow, expressionless equanimity of creatures who had transcended the need to be embarrassed about anything. He had come back to himself on day 6, realized what had happened, and had been in the process of preparing the dismissal ritual when the letter arrived. Inside the envelope was a notice. It was 3 pages long, single-spaced, and had clearly been written by someone who was either a lawyer or had simply watched enough legal procedural television to be genuinely dangerous. Notice of violation, case no. SHA 202411847, Dear resident of 14 Crestmore Lane, it has come to the attention of the Shadowpine Estates HOA Compliance and Standards Committee that you are in violation of the following sections of the Shadowpine Estates Community Covenant and Bylaws, hereinafter the Covenant. As amended, Violation 1. Section. Unauthorized landscape modification. The presence of 12 ambulatory skeletal figures in your rear garden constitutes an unauthorized and unapproved alteration to your landscaping. No application for skeletal installation was submitted. No variance was requested. The Community Aesthetics Subcommittee has determined that said skeletons are inconsistent with the Shadowpine Estates unified exterior palette, which does not include bone white as an approved accent color for rear-facing garden features. Violation 2. Section 11.2, excessive noise after designated quiet hours. Multiple residents have reported persistent rattling, clattering, and what one neighbor described as a sound like someone shaking a bag of wooden spoons in a metal bucket, but more unsettling between the hours of 10:00 p.m. and 6:00 a.m. This constitutes a violation of Shadowpine Estates Quiet Hours Ordinance. Please note that the phrase, "they're dead, they don't know what time it is not considered a valid defense under Section 11.2 Violation 3, Section 7.1a, Unauthorized Grave Disturbance. The HOA has been contacted by the Birch Street Municipal Cemetery regarding a report of unlawful exhumation. While the HOA acknowledges that this is primarily a matter for law enforcement, we note that Section 7.1a of the Covenant explicitly prohibits any resident from engaging in activities that bring negative attention to the community. Raising the dead from a public cemetery is considered, under the interpretation of the Standards Committee, to bring negative attention to the community. Violation 4. Section 9.3, Unapproved Decoration. 1. Skeletal figure has been observed wearing what appears to be a small pointed hat. This constitutes an unapproved decorative element. Pointed hats are not listed in the approved exterior accessory catalog. See Appendix F, pages 4467. Please remove immediately. Total fine: $1,475 to be paid within 14 business days. Failure to pay will result in additional fines, a lien on your property, and referral to the HOA Dispute Resolution Committee, which meets on the third Thursday of every month at 6:30 p.m. in the Shadowpine Estates Community Clubhouse and serves complimentary lemon bars. Regards, Patricia Dunmore, HOA Compliance Officer and Secretary, Standards Committee, Shadowpine Estates HOA, a community worth caring for. Read the letter 3 times. Then he put the kettle on, because some situations required tea before they required dark magic, and this was rapidly becoming one of them. He was not, in principle, opposed to the concept of community standards. He understood that civilization required certain shared agreements. Don't poison the wells, don't curse your neighbor's livestock. Don't raise an undead army without checking whether your property was in a deed-restricted area. These were reasonable expectations. He had, in fact, read the covenant when he had purchased the house. Or more accurately, he had read the first 11 pages before concluding that no document this tedious could contain anything that applied to him. This had, in retrospect, been an error in judgment. He poured his tea and picked up the phone. The number at the bottom of the letter connected him to a voicemail that said, in a voice both warm and implacably firm, "You've reached the Shadowpine Estates HOA office. Our hours are Tuesday and Thursday, 9 to noon. Please leave a message with your name, address, and case number. Have a wonderful day." The last 4 words were delivered with an enthusiasm that suggested the speaker had never once in their entire life doubted that days could be wonderful. He left a message. He was almost entirely polite. He then went to the backyard, looked at his 12 skeletons, sighed in the way that people sigh when they realize they have made a series of decisions that seemed individually reasonable and have collectively produced a situation that could be charitably described as suboptimal, and began the dismissal ritual. It took 45 minutes. By the time the last skeleton had dissolved gracefully back into whatever metaphysical holding space skeletons inhabited when not actively employed, Mortivex had been seen from 4 different kitchen windows by 4 different neighbors, at least 2 of whom had their phones out. Patricia Dunmore was not, by her own account, an unreasonable woman. She was, by her own account, simply a woman who cared deeply about community standards, property values, and the principle that the rules applied to everyone equally, even people who apparently thought that having a doctorate in forbidden arts from an institution she had never heard of exempted them from Section 4.7b. She had been HOA compliance officer for 11 years. In that time, she had issued fines for an unapproved fence, mahogany, not cedar, per section 6.2, 3 unapproved paint colors, a trampoline that exceeded the permitted diameter by 14 inches, a satellite dish mounted on the front face of the house rather than the rear, 2 separate incidents of holiday lighting left up past the February 1st deadline, and a wind chime that had been deemed persistently intrusive by the Noise Ordinance Subcommittee following a formal complaint petition signed by 7 neighbors. She had never, in 11 years, issued a fine for unauthorized skeletal figures, grave disturbance, or unapproved pointed hats on undead garden features. She was going to be honest with herself. The skeleton situation had required some creative interpretation of the existing bylaws, but she was confident it was defensible. The Standards Committee had reviewed it. Gerald from number 22 had some concerns about the grave disturbance section being somewhat outside their jurisdiction, but Gerald always had concerns about something, and his concerns had never once resulted in a successful appeal. The new resident called back on Wednesday morning. She answered on the second ring. "This is Mortivex," said a voice that sounded like it had been dipped in minor chord progressions and aged in a cask of winter. "I received your notice," said Patricia. "Thank you for calling back. I trust you had a chance to review the violations." "I had a chance to review them," said Mortivex, "and I have several questions." "Of course," said Patricia. "That's what we're here for." "My first question," said Mortivex, "is how a skeletal figure constitutes a landscape modification when it was not affixed to the ground, was not a permanent installation, and was not, in any sense that I would consider legally robust, a garden feature." "Definition of garden feature," said Patricia pleasantly, "includes any element that is present in the garden." There was a pause. "That's a very broad definition," said Mortivex. "It's intentionally comprehensive," said Patricia. "We found that more specific definitions created loopholes." Another pause, this one slightly longer. "My second question," said Mortivex, "concerns the noise violation. The skeletons were dismissed 2 days ago. The noise is no longer occurring. On what basis do you fine a resident for a violation that has ceased?" "The fine is for the violation that occurred," said Patricia. "The cessation of the violation doesn't retroactively make it not have happened." "I see," said Mortivex. "And the grave disturbance, section 7(1)(a), said Patricia. Activities that bring negative attention to the community. Has the community received negative attention?" "A reporter from the local paper called," said Patricia. "She was asking about the skeletons. She write an article, she has not yet published one, but the potential for negative attention is sufficient under our interpretation of 7(1)(a). There was a very long pause, and the hat, said Mortivex with the careful tone of a man who has decided that only one battle at a time is survivable. Section 9.3, said Patricia. Unapproved decorative elements. "It was a hat," said Mortivex, "on a skeleton that I raised in my own backyard." "The hat was visible from the street," said Patricia. "Under Section 9.3, any decorative element visible from a public thoroughfare is subject to approval. The approved exterior accessory catalog does not include pointed hats." "What does the catalog include?" "Shepherd's hooks in black or bronze only. Tasteful garden lanterns. 1 approved birdbath design, available in 3 colorways. Seasonal wreaths as specified in Appendix G." "Does the catalog include skeletons?" "It does not," said Patricia. "Which is why." "Then how," said Mortivex, with the careful precision of a man filing an objection in a tribunal that has already decided the verdict, "was I supposed to know the hat required separate approval?" Patricia blinked. This was, she had to admit, technically a fair point. But she had been doing this for 11 years, and she had never let a fair point get between a resident and their fine. "The absence of skeletons in the catalog," she said, "does not imply their approval. It implies they were not anticipated. The hat, however, is a discrete item that could reasonably have been submitted for review." "Under what timeline?" 30 days prior to installation. "The skeleton was raised at 11:45 p.m., said Mortivex. "It was wearing the hat by midnight." "Retroactive approval applications are available," said Patricia, "at a processing fee of $65. Silence that followed was the kind that had a specific temperature, cold, precise, and absolutely not surprised. "I will be attending the dispute resolution meeting," said Mortivex. "Wonderful," said Patricia. "Third Thursday, 6:30. Lemon bars are provided." He prepared for the meeting the way he prepared for everything, methodically and with an aesthetic commitment to being taken seriously. He wore the good robe, not the working robe, which had acquired certain stains that he had decided were a feature rather than a bug, but the formal robe, black velvet with silver trim, which had cost an amount he still wasn't comfortable thinking about but which communicated unmistakably that its wearer had arrived with intentions. He brought a folder. The folder contained a printed copy of the Shadowpine Estates covenant, annotated in the margins in red ink, cross-referenced with 3 cases he had found in county property law records, and accompanied by a 2-page memorandum he had written himself titled, "In re. The matter of violation notices SHA 20241847 through 1850. A preliminary objection to jurisdictional scope and definitional overreach." He also brought the hat. For purposes of demonstration, the Shadowpine Estates Community Clubhouse was a beige building with a green awning and a sign that read "Welcome to your community hub," in letters that had once been painted gold and were now fading to a color that might charitably be called aspirational. Inside, 12 folding chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing a table, at which 4 people sat with the particular posture of individuals who are deeply committed to the idea that they hold power. The 4 people were Patricia Dunmore, compliance officer, reading glasses on a beaded chain, energy of a woman who has prepared extensively for this. Gerald Finch, standards committee member, anxious expression, clearly already regretting being here. Donna Hayworth, treasurer, enormous cup of coffee, expression of someone watching a situation develop that they had privately predicted would develop. And Bob Strickland, committee chair. A man who had the look of someone who had achieved his life's ambition by becoming chair of a homeowners association, and was aware, on some level, that this was both genuinely satisfying and philosophically melancholy. There were also 8 other residents in the folding chairs, all of whom had presumably come because they had nothing else going on a Thursday evening, and skeletal figures were more interesting than whatever was streaming. 3 of them had brought the lemon bars to their seats already. Mortivex sat down, placed his folder on his lap, and waited. "Welcome to the October dispute resolution meeting of the Shadowpine Estates HOA," said Bob Strickland, reading from an agenda that had clearly been printed specifically for this occasion. "We have one item on tonight's agenda, the appeal submitted by the resident of 14 Crestmore Lane regarding violations, SHA 20241847 through 1850. I'll turn it over to our compliance officer, Patricia, to summarize the violations, and then we'll hear from the resident." Patricia summarized the violations. She did so with the calm thoroughness of someone who had done this before and expected to win. Then it was Mortivex's turn. He stood up, opened the folder, and began. On the matter of violation 1, the garden feature, he noted that the covenant's definition of garden feature in section referenced only permanent or semi-permanent installations affixed to the ground or supported by fixed infrastructure. The skeletons had been neither affixed nor supported by fixed infrastructure. They had been ambulatory. They had also, he noted, been temporary, and the covenant in section 4.7c explicitly exempted temporary features of duration less than 30 days from the approval requirement. The skeletons had been present for 8 days. Patricia pointed out that ambulatory was not listed in the exemptions. Mortivex pointed out that the covenant had been written in 1987, and the drafters had likely not anticipated the need to specify whether exemptions applied to things that could walk under their own power. Gerald said, under his breath but audibly, "He's got a point." Patricia shot Gerald a look that communicated 11 years of unspoken institutional authority. On violation 2, the noise, Mortivex acknowledged that the rattling had occurred, that it had occurred after quiet hours, and that it had occurred on multiple nights. He did not dispute any of this. He disputed, instead, the quantum of the fine, noting that the noise ordinance in Section 11.2 provided for a fine of $50 per incident, defined as a single continuous period of noise, and that the HOA had imposed a flat fine of $350 without specifying the number of incidents alleged. Donna looked at her coffee. Bob looked at the agenda. Patricia said, "The fine reflects the duration and severity of the disturbance." Said, "Then I would ask for the calculation." There was a pause during which it became apparent to everyone in the room, and possibly to Patricia herself, that the calculation had not been performed, and the fine had been selected on the basis of what felt appropriate, which was not, technically, what the covenant specified. "We can review the fine amount," said Donna, who had apparently decided that getting through the evening without a formal legal challenge was worth something. On violation 3, the grave disturbance, Mortivex set down his papers, looked at the committee and said, with the careful measured tone of a man who has decided to be reasonable about something that is, objectively, not fully reasonable. Section 7(1)(a) prohibits activities that bring negative attention to the community. A reporter made a phone call. No article was published. No attention, negative or otherwise, was brought. Under Section 7(1)(a), the violation requires that the negative attention have actually occurred, not that it might theoretically occur in the future. I would also note that I am not aware of any HOA bylaw in this covenant or in any other that gives a homeowners association standing to adjudicate the legal activities of a resident at a location other than the residential property in question. Gerald said, more audibly this time, "He's definitely got a point." Patricia said, "Gerald." Gerald said, "I'm just saying." "Grave disturbance violation," said Bob Strickland slowly, "was perhaps a bit outside our usual scope." "It was," said Mortivex. "I would like it withdrawn." There was a brief committee consultation, conducted in the kind of murmured undertone that is not actually quiet but is performed as though it is, and then Bob said, "Violation 3 is withdrawn." Patricia looked at her notepad and made a mark that may have been a check mark or may have been a wound. On violation 4, the hat, Mortivex picked it up. It was a small black pointed hat, approximately 4 inches tall, with a tiny brim and a silver buckle. He held it up to the room. "This," he said, "is a hat." No one disputed this. It was placed on a skeletal figure that was in my rear garden. The rear garden is not visible from the street under normal viewing conditions. Section 9.3 applies to decorative elements visible from a public thoroughfare. I would ask the committee to confirm whether the hat, at its observed height of approximately 14 inches above ground on the figure wearing it, was actually visible from Crestmore Lane. He had, anticipating this moment, measured the fence height and the approximate sightline angle the previous evening. The fence was 6 feet. The hat had been on a skeleton that stood approximately 5'6". The hat would have been visible from the street only to someone who was actively looking over a 6-foot fence, which was not a behavior the public thoroughfare in question typically invited. The committee looked at each other. "It visible from the street," said Bob. "I personally observed it from the street," said Patricia. "Where were you standing?" said Mortivex. There was a pause. "I was standing on the sidewalk," said Patricia. "At what elevation?" "I was standing on the sidewalk," Patricia repeated, with the tone of a woman who has not, until this moment, considered that the question of where she was standing might matter. "Were you on the sidewalk itself?" said Mortivex. "Or were you standing on something?" The pause that followed was of a specific variety. The pause of a person who has been asked a question to which the true answer is unflattering, and is now calculating whether the unflattering truth or the false answer causes more damage. "I was standing on the curb," said Patricia. "Which is elevated approximately 4 to 6 inches above the street grade," said Mortivex. He produced, from the folder, a printout from the County Property Survey website showing the elevation of the curb on Crestmore Lane. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the previous quiet. This was not the quiet of people waiting for someone to finish talking. This was the quiet of people who had come for a Thursday evening HOA meeting, and had gotten something considerably more interesting than they had expected. One of the residents eating lemon bars appeared to be taking notes. Violation 4, said Donna, looking at her coffee. Seems like it might be worth revisiting. Meeting concluded 40 minutes later. The outcome, which Patricia logged in the official minutes with the stoic brevity of a soldier recording a tactical retreat, was as follows. Violation 1, garden feature. Fine reduced to 0, citing the temporary nature exemption under Section 4. 7c. Pending review by the legal subcommittee, which would convene as soon as they found someone willing to be on the legal subcommittee. Violation 2, noise. Fine revised from $350 to $150, representing 3 discrete incidents at the established rate of $50 per incident, subject to further negotiation pending the resident's submission of a written timeline. Violation 3, grave disturbance. Withdrawn. Violation 4, hat. Fine reduced to 0 based on insufficient evidence of visibility from a public thoroughfare under standard conditions, notwithstanding the compliance officer's personal observation from an elevated position. Total fine, $150 down from $475. Patricia drove home in the kind of silence that has a temperature. She made a note on her legal pad. Draft amendment to 4.7b. Add definition of ambulatory. Draft amendment to 9.3, specify viewing conditions, include curb. Draft amendment to 9x new, prohibit skeletal figures, ambulatory or otherwise. She would bring it to the January Covenant Review meeting. She had been doing this for 11 years. She was not done. Mortivex drove home with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who had prepared for a thing, and the preparation had, against reasonable odds, worked. He made tea. He sat in the kitchen, which smelled of old books and something faintly sulphurous that he had long since stopped noticing, and he allowed himself approximately 12 minutes of satisfaction before he picked up the folder again and looked at what remained. $150. He was going to pay it. This was the pragmatic calculation. Paying a reduced and legitimately assessed fine was different from paying an inflated and legally dubious one, and he was not going to litigate $50 per incident for 3 incidents when the alternative was becoming the kind of neighbor who had ongoing disputes with the HOA, which was a category of person that, in his experience, tended to end up either on the committee or in court. He was not joining the committee. He wrote the check. He put it in an envelope. He addressed it to the Shadowpine Estates HOA. Then he went back to the basement, where his current project was proceeding considerably better than the skeleton situation, and did not think about Patricia Dunmore for almost 48 hours, which was a personal best. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived. It was a Tuesday again. He was beginning to develop a philosophical position on Tuesdays. This one was different in tone, less formal. Almost, and he recognized this word did not apply to any communication he had yet received from Shadowpine Estates HOA. Apologetic. Dear resident of 14 Crestmore Lane, I am writing on behalf of the Shadowpine Estates HOA Community Outreach Committee. A subcommittee formed last Tuesday in response to circumstances you are aware of. We would like to extend an invitation to the November community gathering, to be held Saturday the 16th at 4 p.m. in the clubhouse. Light refreshments will be provided. Additionally, and separately, the Standards Committee has been made aware that you may be in possession of professional expertise that could be of use to the community. As you may know, the cemetery at the north end of Shadowpine Estates has experienced issues with unauthorized access, vandalism, and one incident of attempted paranormal investigation by teenagers from the neighboring development. The committee wondered whether you might be willing to consult on security arrangements. In exchange for a credit toward any future HOA fees, please let us know if you're interested. Again, refreshments will be provided. Regards, Donna Hayworth, Treasurer and Acting Chair, Community Outreach Committee, Shadowpine Estates HOA. Read it twice. Then he read it a third time, because certain documents warranted a third reading, particularly those that contained offers you were fairly certain you shouldn't accept and were going to accept anyway. He put the kettle on. He thought about the cemetery. He thought about the teenagers. He thought about what consulting on security arrangements might mean to someone with his particular skill set, and whether the HOA fully understood what they were asking for, and whether the answer to that question mattered. He thought about the $150. He picked up the phone. "Donna Hayworth," said the phone. "This is Mortivex," he said, "from 14 Crestmore Lane." "Oh, wonderful," said Donna, and she sounded genuinely like she meant it. "Have some questions about the cemetery consultation," he said. "Of course," said Donna. "Firstly," he said, "I would need to know what you consider an acceptable security outcome. Specifically, whether you want the teenagers deterred, or whether you want them to have a specific and formative experience that will cause them to avoid cemeteries for the remainder of their natural lives." There was a pause. "The second one," said Donna, "sounds more effective." Said Mortivex. "It does involve skeletons." Another pause. "Would they need to be approved by the Standards Committee?" said Donna. "Deally," said Mortivex, "before installation." "Send you the form," said Donna. 30-day prior approval, as I'm sure you know, though in this case I suspect we could fast-track it." "I would appreciate that," said Mortivex. "Hat," said Donna, and he could hear her not quite smiling in the pause, "is optional." "The hat," said Mortivex, with a dignity he was not sure he had entirely earned, "stays." "Then I'll note it in the application," said Donna. "We'll see you Saturday." He hung up. He went to the window and looked at the backyard where the skeletons had been. The grass was still a little odd in the places where they'd walked most frequently, a geometric pattern of slightly too green that wouldn't look unusual to anyone who wasn't looking for it. He supposed he should address that eventually. Section 4. 7b, as amended, would probably have opinions. He made a note to check the covenant revision schedule. Then he went back to the basement, where the real work was, and where nobody from the Standards Committee had yet developed an opinion about what he was doing, which was, by his current estimation, the only truly protected space he had left. He gave it 3 weeks before they found a section that applied. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.